Chapter 1 of the Metropolis. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Richard Kilmer, San Antonio, Texas. The Metropolis by Upton Sinclair. "Return at 10:30, the General said to his chauffeur, and then they entered the corridor of the hotel. Montague gazed about him, and found himself trembling just a little with anticipation. It was not the magnificence of the place. The quiet uptown hotel would have seemed magnificent to him, fresh as he was from the country. But he did not see the marble columns and the gilded carvings. He was thinking of the men he was to meet. It seemed too much to crowd into one day. First the visions of the whirling, seething city, the center of all his hopes of the future, and then, at night, this meeting, overwhelming him with the crowded memories of everything that he held precious in the past. There were groups of men in faded uniforms standing about in the corridors. General Prentice bowed here and there as they retired and took the elevator to the reception rooms. In the doorway they passed a stout little man with stubby white mustaches, and the General stopped, exclaiming, "Hello, Major." Then he added, "Let me introduce Mr. Allen Montague. Montague, this is Major Thorne." A look of sudden interest flashed across the Major's face. "General Montague's son?" he cried. And then he seized the other's hand in both of his, exclaiming, my boy, I'm glad to see you." Now Montague was no boy. He was a man of 30, and rather sedate in his appearance and manner. There was enough in his 6'1" to have made two of the round and rubicund little Major, and yet it seemed to him quite proper that the other should address him so. He was back in his boyhood tonight. He was a boy whenever anyone mentioned the name of Major Thorne. "Perhaps you have heard your father speak of me?" asked the Major eagerly, and Montague answered, "1,000 times." He was tempted to add that the vision that rose before him was of a stout gentleman hanging in a grapevine, while a whole battery of artillery made him their target. Perhaps it was irreverent, but that was what Montague had always thought of, ever since he had first laughed over the tale his father told. It happened one January afternoon in the wilderness, during the terrible battle of Chancellorsville, when Montague's father had been a rising young staff officer, and it had fallen to his lot to carry to Major Thorne what was surely the most terrifying order that ever a cavalry officer received. It was in the crisis of the conflict, when the Army of the Potomac was reeling before the onslaught of Stonewall Jackson's columns. There was no one to stop them, and yet they must be stopped, for the whole right wing of the army was going. So that cavalry regiment had charged full tilt through the thickets, and into a solid wall of infantry and artillery. The crash of their volley was blinding, and the horses were fairly shot to fragments, and the Major's horse, with its lower jaw torn off, had plunged madly away and left its rider hanging in the aforementioned grapevine. After he had kicked himself loose, it was to find himself in an arena where pain-maddened horses and frenzied men raced about amid a rain of Minnie balls and canister. And in this inferno the gallant Major had captured a horse, and rallied the remnants of his shattered command, and held the line until help came, and then helped to hold it, all through the afternoon and the twilight and the night, against charge after charge. And now to stand and gaze at this stout and red-nosed little personage, and realize that these mighty deeds had been his. Then, even while Montague was returning his hand clasp and telling him of his pleasure, the Major's eye caught someone across the room, and he called eagerly, "Colonel Anderson! Colonel Anderson!" And this was the heroic Jack Anderson, Parson Anderson, the men had called him, because he always prayed before everything he did. Prayers at each mess, a prayer meeting in the evening, and the rumor said Colonel prayed on while his men slept. With his battery of artillery trained to perfection under 3 years of divine guidance, the gallant colonel had stood in the line of battle at Cold Harbor, name of frightful memory, and when the enemy had swarmed out of their entrenchments and swept back the whole line just beyond him, his battery had stood like a cape in a storm-beaten ocean, attacked on 2 sides at once, and for the half hour that elapsed before infantry support came up, the colonel had ridden slowly up and down his line, repeating in calm and godly accents, "Give 'em hell, boys, give 'em hell." The colonel's hand trembled now as he held it out, and his voice was shrill and cracked as he told what pleasure it gave him to meet General Montague's son. "Why have we never seen you before?" asked Major Thorne. Montague replied that he had spent all his life in Mississippi, his father having married a Southern woman after the war. Once every year the general had come to New York to attend the reunion of the Loyal Legion of the state. But someone had had to stay at home with his mother, Montague explained. There were perhaps 100 men in the room, and he was passed about from group to group. Many of them had known his father intimately. It seemed almost uncanny to him to meet them in the body, to find them old and feeble, white-haired and wrinkled. As they lived in the chambers of his memory, they were in their mighty youth heroes, transfigured and radiant, not subject to the power of time. Life on the big plantation had been a lonely one, especially for a Southern-born man who had fought in the Union Army. General Montague had been a person of quiet tastes, and his greatest pleasure had been to sit with his 2 boys on his knees and fight his battles over again. He had collected all the literature of the corps which he had commanded, and a whole library of it, in which Allen learned to find his way as soon as he could read. He had literally been brought up on the war. For hours he would lie buried in some big illustrated history, until people came and called him away. He studied maps of campaigns and battlefields, until they became alive with human passion and struggle. He knew the Army of the Potomac by brigade and division, with the names of commanders and their faces, and their ways, until they lived and spoke. And the bare roll of their names had power to thrill him. And now here were the men themselves, and all these scenes and memories crowding upon him in tumultuous throngs. No wonder he was a little dazed, and could hardly find words to answer when he was spoken to. But then came an incident which called him suddenly back to the world of the present. "There is Judge Ellis," said the General. Judge Ellis! The fame of his wit and eloquence had reached even far Mississippi. Was there any remotest corner of America where men had not heard of the silver tongue of Judge Ellis? Cultivate him, Montague's brother Oliver had laughed, when it was mentioned that the judge would be present. Cultivate him, he may be useful. It was not difficult to cultivate one who was as gracious as Judge Ellis. He stood in the doorway, a smooth, perfectly groomed gentleman, conspicuous in the uniformed assembly by his evening dress. The judge was stout and jovial and cultivated, Dundreary whiskers and a beaming smile. "General Montague's son!" he exclaimed as he pressed the young man's hands. Why, I'm surprised. Why have we never seen you before?" Montague explained that he had only been in New York about 6 hours. "Oh, I see," said the judge. "And shall you remain long?" "I have come to stay," was the reply. "Well, well," said the other cordially. "Then we may see more of you. Are you going into business?" "I'm a lawyer," said Montague. "I expect to practice." The judge's quick glance had been taking the measure of the tall, handsome man before him, with his raven black hair and grave features. "You must give us a chance to try your mettle," he said, and then, as others approached to meet him, he was forced to pass on. He laid a caressing hand on Montague's arm, whispering with a sly smile, "I mean it." Montague felt his heart beat a little faster. He had not welcomed his brother's suggestion. There was nothing of the sycophant in him. But he meant to work and to succeed, and he knew what the favor of a man like Judge Ellis would mean to him. For the judge was the idol of New York's business and political aristocracy, and the doorway of fortune yielded at his touch. There were rows of chairs in one of the rooms, and here 200 or 300 men were gathered. There were stands of battle flags in the corners, each one of them a scroll of tragic history, to one like Montague, who understood. His eyes roamed over them while the secretary was reading minutes of meetings and other routine announcements. Then he began to study the assemblage. There were men with one arm and men with one leg. One tottering old soldier, 90 years of age, stone blind, and led about by his friends. The Loyal Legion was an officers' organization, and to that extent aristocratic. But worldly success counted for nothing in it. Some of its members were struggling to exist on their pensions, and were as much thought of as a man like General Prentice, who was president of one of the city's largest banks, and a rich man, even in New York's understanding of that term. The presiding officer introduced Colonel Robert Selden, who will read the paper of the evening, Recollections of Spotsylvania. Montague started at the name, for Bob Selden had been one of his father's messmates, and had fought all through the Peninsula campaign at his side. He was a tall, hawk-faced man with a gray imperial. The room was still as he rose, and after adjusting his glasses, he began to read his story. He recalled the situation of the Army of the Potomac in the spring of 1864. For 3 years it had marched and fought, stumbled through defeat after defeat, a mighty weapon lacking only a man who could wield it. Now at last the man had come, one who would put them into the battle and give them a chance to fight. So they had marched into the wilderness, and there Lee struck them, and for 3 days they groped in a blind thicket, fighting hand to hand amid suffocating smoke. The colonel read in a quiet, unassuming voice, but one could see that he had had hold of his hearers by the light that crossed their features when he told of the army's recoil from the shock, and of the wild joy that ran through the ranks when they took up their march to the left, and realized that this time they were not going back. So they came to the 12 days' grapple of the Spotsylvania campaign. There was still the wilderness thicket. The enemy's entrenchments, covering about 8 miles, lay in the shape of a dome, and at the cupola of it were breastworks of heavy timbers banked with earth, and with a ditch and tangle of trees in front. The place was the keystone of the Confederate arch, and the name of it was the Angle. Bloody Angle, Montague heard the man who sat next to him drawing his breath, as if a spasm of pain had shot through him. At dawn 2 brigades had charged and captured the place. The enemy returned to attack, and for 20 hours thereafter the 2 armies fought, hurling regiment after regiment and brigade after brigade into the trenches. There was a pouring rain, and the smoke hung black about them. They could only see the flashes of the guns and the faces of the enemy here and there. The colonel described the approach of his regiment. They lay down for a moment in a swamp, and the Minnie balls sang like swarming bees and split the blades of grass above them. Then they charged over ground that ran with human blood. In the trenches the bodies of dead and dying men lay 3 deep, and were trampled out of sight in the mud by the feet of those who fought. They would crouch behind the works, lifting their guns high over their heads and firing into the throngs on the other side. Again and again men sprang upon the breastworks and fired their muskets, and then fell dead. They dragged up cannon, one after another, and blew holes through the logs, and raked the ground with charges of canister. While the Colonel read, still in his calm, matter-of-fact voice, you might see men leaning forward in their chairs, hands clenched, teeth set. They knew, they knew. Had there ever before been a time in history when breastworks had been charged by artillery? 24 men in the crew of one gun, and only 2 unhurt. One iron sponge bucket with 39 bullet holes shot through it. And then blasts of canister sweeping the trenches, and blowing scores of living and dead men to fragments. And into this hell of slaughter new regiments charging, in lines 4 deep. And squad after squad of the enemy striving to surrender, and shot to pieces by their own comrades as they clambered over the blood-soaked walls. And heavy timbers in the defenses shot to splinters. Huge oak trees, one of them 24 inches in diameter, crashing down upon the combatants, gnawed through by rifle bullets. Since the world began, had men ever fought like that? Then the Colonel told of his own wound in the shoulder, and how toward dusk he had crawled away, and how he became lost and strayed into the enemy lines, and was thrust into a batch of prisoners and marched to the rear. And then of the night that he spent beside a hospital camp in the wilderness, where hundreds of wounded and dying men lay about on the rain-soaked ground, moaning, screaming, praying to be killed. Again the prisoners were moved, having been ordered to march to the railroad, and on the way the Colonel went blind from suffering and exhaustion, and staggered and fell in the road. You could have heard a pin drop in the room. In the pause between the sentences in his story, as he told how the guard argued with him to persuade him to go on, it was their duty to kill him if he refused, but they could not bring themselves to do it. In the end they left the job to one, and he stood and cursed the officer, trying to get up his courage, and finally fired his gun into the air and went off and left him. Then he told how an old Negro had found him, and how he lay delirious, and how at last the army marched his way. He ended his narrative the simple sentence, "It was not until the siege of Petersburg that I was able to rejoin my command." There was a murmur of applause and then silence. Suddenly, from somewhere in the room, came the sound of singing. "My eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord." The old battle hymn seemed to strike the very mood of the meeting. The whole throng took it up, and they sang it stanza by stanza. It was rolling forth like a mighty organ chant as they came to the fervid closing. "He hath sounded forth the trumpet that shall never call retreat. He's sifting out the hearts of men before his judgment seat. Oh, be swift, my soul, to answer him. Be jubilant, my feet. Our God is marching on." There was a pause again, and the presiding officer rose and said that, owing to the presence of a distinguished guest, they would forego one of their rules and invite Judge Ellis to say a few words. The judge came forward and bowed his acknowledgment of their welcome. Then, perhaps feeling a need of relief after the somber recital, the judge took occasion to apologize for his own temerity in addressing a room full of warriors. And somehow he managed to make that remind him of a story of an army mule. A very amusing story, and that reminded him of another story. Until when he stopped and sat down, everyone in the room broke into delighted applause. They went in to dinner. Montague sat by General Prentice, and he in turn by the judge. The latter was reminded of more stories during the dinner, and kept everyone near him laughing. Finally Montague was moved to tell a story himself, about an old Negro down home who passed himself off as an Indian. The judge was so good as to consider this an immensely funny story, and asked permission to tell it himself. Several times after that he leaned over and spoke to Montague, who felt a slight twinge of guilt as he recalled his brother's cynical advice cultivate him. The judge was so willing to be cultivated, however, that it gave one's conscience little chance. They went back to the meeting room again. Chairs were shifted and little groups formed, and cigars and pipes brought out. They moved the precious battle flags forward, and someone produced a bugle and a couple of drums. Then the walls of the place shook as the whole company burst forth. "Bring the good old bugle, boys. We'll sing another song. Sing it with a spirit that will start the world along. Sing it as we used to sing it, 50,000 strong, while we were marching through Georgia." It was wonderful to witness the fervor with which they went through this rollicking chant, whose spirit we miss because we hear it too often. They were not skilled musicians. They could only sing loud, but the fire leaped into their eyes, and they swayed with the rhythm and sang. Montague found himself watching the old blind soldier, who sat beating his foot in time, upon his face the look of one who sees visions. And then he noticed another man, a little red-faced Irishman, one of the drummers. The very spirit of the drum seemed to have entered into him, into his hands and feet, his eyes and his head, and his round little body. He played long rolls between the verses, and it seemed as if he must surely be swept away upon the wings of it. Catching Montague's eye, he nodded and smiled, and after that, every once in a while their eyes would meet and exchange a greeting. They sang "The Loyal Legionnaire," and "The Army Bean," and "John Brown's Body," and "Tramp, tramp, tramp, the boys are marching." All the while the drum rattled and thundered, and the little drummer laughed and sang, the very incarnation of the carefree spirit of the soldier. They stopped for a while, and the little man came over and was introduced. Lieutenant O'Day was his name. And after he had left, General Prentice leaned over to Montague and told him a story. "That little man," he said, "began as a drummer boy in my regiment, and went all through the war in my brigade. And 2 years ago I met him on the street one cold winter night, as thin as I am, and shivering in a summer coat. I took him to dinner with me and watched him eat, and I made up my mind there was something wrong. I made him take me home, and do you know, the man was starving. He had a little tobacco shop, and he had got into trouble. The trust had taken away his trade, and he had a sick wife and a daughter clerking at $6 a week." The General went on to tell of his struggle to induce the little man to accept his aid, perhaps a loan of a few $100s from Prentice, the banker. "I never had anything hurt me so in all my life," he said. "Finally I took him into the bank, and now you can see he has enough to eat." They began to sing again, and Montague sat and thought over the story. It seemed to him typical of the thing that made this meeting beautiful to him, the spirit of brotherhood and service that reigned here. They sang, "We are tenting tonight on the old camp ground," and they sang, "Benny Heavens, oh," and "A Soldier No More." They sang other songs of tenderness and sorrow, and men felt a trembling in their voices and a mist stealing over their eyes. Upon Montague a spell was falling. Over these men and their story there hung a mystery, a presence of wonder, that discloses itself but rarely to mortals, and only to those who have dreamed and dared. They had not found it easy to do their duty. They had had their wives and children, their homes and friends and familiar places, and all these they had left to serve the Republic. They had taught themselves a new way of life. They had forged themselves into an iron sword of war. They had marched and fought in dust and heat, in pouring rains and driving icy blasts. They had become men grim and terrible in spirit, men with limbs of steel, who could march or ride for days and nights, who could lie down and sleep upon the ground in rainstorms and winter snows, who were ready to leap at a word and seize their muskets and rush into the cannon's mouth. They had learned to stare into the face of death, to meet its fiery eyes, to march and eat and sleep, to laugh and play and sing in its presence, to carry their life in their hands and toss it about as a juggler tosses a ball. And this for freedom, for the star-crowned goddess with the flaming eyes, who trod upon the mountain tops and called to them in the shock and fury of battle, whose trailing robes they followed through the dust and cannon smoke, for a glimpse of whose shining face they had kept the long night vigils and charged upon the guns in the morning, for a touch of whose shining robe they had wasted in prison pens, where famine and loathsome pestilence and raving madness stalked about in the broad daylight. And now this army of deliverance, with its waving banners and its prancing horses and its rumbling cannon, had marched into the shadow world. The very ground that it had trod was sacred, and one who fingered the dusty volumes which held the records of its deeds would feel a strange awe come upon him and thrill with a sudden fear of life that was so fleeting and so little to be understood. There were boyhood memories in Montague's mind, of hours of consecration, when the vision had descended upon him as he sat with face hidden in his hands. It was for the Republic that these men had suffered, for him and his children, that a government of the people, by the people, for the people, might not perish from the earth. And with the organ music of the Gettysburg Address echoing within him, the boy laid his soul upon the altar of his country. They had done so much for him, and now, was there anything he could do? A dozen years had passed since then, and still he knew that deep within him, deeper than all other purposes, than all thoughts of wealth and fame and power, was the purpose that the men who had died for the Republic should find him worthy of their trust. The singing had stopped, and Judge Ellis was standing before him. The judge was about to go, and in his caressing voice he said that he would hope to see Montague again. Then, seeing that General Prentice was also standing up, Montague threw off the spell that had gripped him, and shook his hands with the little drummer, and with Selden and Anderson and all the others of his dream people. A few minutes later he found himself outside the hotel, drinking deep draughts of the cold November air. Major Thorne had come out with them, and learning that the General's route lay uptown, he offered to walk with Montague to his hotel. They set out, and then Montague told the Major about the figure in the grapevine, and the Major laughed and told how it had felt. There had been more adventures, it seemed. While he was hunting a horse, he had come upon two mules loaded with ammunition, and entangled with their harnesses about a tree. He had rushed up to seize them, when a solid shot had struck the tree and exploded the ammunition and blown the mules to fragments. And then there was the story of the charge late in the night, which had recovered lost ground and kept Stonewall Jackson busy up to the very hour of his tragic death. And there was the story of Andersonville and the escape from prison. Montague could have walked the streets all night, exchanging these wartime reminiscences with the Major. Absorbed in their talk, they came to an avenue given up to the poorer class of people, with elevated trains rattling by overhead, and rows of little shops along it. Montague noticed a dense crowd on one of the corners, and asked what it meant. "Some sort of meeting," said the Major. They came nearer, and saw a torch with a man standing near it, above the heads of the crowd. "It looks like a political meeting," said Montague, "but it can't be, now, just after election." "Probably it's a Socialist," said the Major. "They're at it all the time." They crossed the avenue, and then they could see plainly. The man was lean and hungry looking. He had long arms, which he waved with prodigious violence. He was in a frenzy of excitement, pacing this way and that, and leaning over the throng packed about him. Because of a passing train, the two could not hear a sound. "A Socialist!" exclaimed Montague, wonderingly. "What do they want?" "I'm not sure," said the other. They want to overthrow the government." The train passed, and then the man's words came to them. "They force you to build palaces, and then they put you into tenements. They force you to spin fine raiments, and then they dress you in rags. They force you to build jails, and then they lock you up in them. They force you to make guns, and then they shoot you with them. They own the political parties, and they name the candidates, and trick you into voting for them, and they call it the law. They herd you into armies and send you to shoot your brothers, and they call it order. They take a piece of colored rag and call it a flag, and teach you to let yourself be shot, and they call it patriotism. First, last, and all the time you do the work and they get the benefit. They the masters and owners, and you fools, fools, fools." The man's voice had mounted to a scream, and he flung his hands into the air and broke into jeering laughter. Then came another train, and Montague could not hear him, but he could see that he was rushing on in the torrent of his denunciation. Montague stood rooted to the spot. He was shocked to the depths of his being. He could scarcely contain himself as he stood there. He longed to spring forward, to beard the man where he stood, to shout him down, to rebuke him before the crowd. The Major must have seen his agitation, for he took his arm and led him back from the throng, saying, "Come, we can't help it." But," he protested, "the police ought to arrest him." "They do sometimes," said the Major, "but it doesn't do any good." They walked on, and the sounds of the shrill voice died away. "Tell me," said Montague in a low voice, "does that go on very often?" "Around the corner from where I live," said the other, "it goes on every Saturday night." "And do people listen?" he asked. "Sometimes they can't keep the street clear," was the reply. Again they walked in silence. At last Montague asked, "What does it mean?" The Major shrugged his shoulders. "Perhaps another civil war," said he. Chapter 1. Chapter 2 of the Metropolis by Upton Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Allan Montague's father had died about 5 years before. A couple of years later his younger brother, Oliver, had announced his intention of seeking a career in New York. He had no profession and no definite plans, but his father's friends were men of influence and wealth, and the doors were open to him. So he had turned his share of the estate into cash and departed. Oliver was a gay and pleasure-loving boy, with all the material of a prodigal son in him. His brother had more than half expected to see him come back in a year or two with empty pockets. But New York had seemed to agree with Oliver. He never told what he was doing. What he wrote was simply that he was managing to keep the wolf from the door. But his letters hinted at expensive ways of life, and at Christmas time and at Cousin Alice's birthday he would send home presents which made the family stare. Montague had always thought of himself as a country lawyer and planter, but 2 months ago a fire had swept away the family mansion, and then on top of that had come an offer for the land. And with Oliver telegraphing several times a day, in his eagerness they had taken the sudden resolution to settle up their affairs and move to New York. There were Montague and his mother, and Cousin Alice, who was 19, and old Mammy Lucy, Mrs. Montague's servant. Oliver had met them at Jersey City, radiant with happiness. He looked just as much of a boy as ever, and just as beautiful, excepting that he was a little paler. New York had not changed him at all. There was a man in uniform from the hotel to take charge of their baggage, and a big red touring car for them. And now they were snugly settled in their apartments, with the younger brother on duty as counselor and guide.
Montague had come to begin life all over again. He had brought his money, and he expected to invest it, and to live upon the income until he had begun to earn something. He had worked hard at his profession, and he meant to work in New York, and to win his way in the end. He knew almost nothing about the city. He faced it with the wide open eyes of a child. One began to learn quickly, he found. It was like being swept into a maelstrom. First the hurrying throngs on the ferry boat, and then the cabmen and the newsboys shouting, and the cars with clanging gongs. Then the swift motor gliding between trucks and carriages and around corners where big policemen shepherded the scurrying populace. And then Fifth Avenue, with its rows of shops and towering hotels, and at last a sudden swing round a corner, and their home. "I have picked a quiet family place for you," Oliver had said, and that had greatly pleased his brother. But he had stared in dismay when he entered this latest apartment hotel, which catered for 200 or 300 of the most exclusive of the city's aristocracy, and noted its great arcade, with massive doors of bronze, its entrance hall, trimmed with Caen stone and Italian marble, and roofed with a vaulted ceiling painted by modern masters. Men in livery bore their wraps and bowed the way before them. A great bronze elevator shot them to the proper floor, and they went to their rooms down a corridor walled with blood-red marble and paved with carpet soft as a cushion. Here were 6 rooms of palatial size, with carpets, drapery, and furniture of a splendor quite appalling to Montague. As soon as the man who bore the wraps had left the room, he turned upon his brother. "Oliver," he said, "how much are we paying for all this?" Oliver smiled. "You are not paying anything, old man," he replied. "You're to be my guest for a month or two, until you get your bearings." "That's very good of you," said the other. "We'll talk about it later. But meantime, tell me what the apartment costs." And then Montague encountered his first full charge of New York dynamite. $600 a week, said Oliver. He started as if his brother had struck him. $600 a week, he gasped. "Yes," said the other quietly. It was fully a minute before he could find his breath. "Brother," he exclaimed, "you're mad." "It is a very good bargain," smiled the other. "I have some influence with them." Again there was a pause, while Montague groped for words. "Oliver," he exclaimed, "I can't believe you. How could you think that we could pay such a price?" "I didn't think it," said Oliver. "I told you I expected to pay it myself." "But how could we let you pay it for us?" cried the other. "Can you fancy that I will ever earn enough to pay such a price?" "Of course you will," said Oliver. "Don't be foolish, Allen. You'll find it easy enough to make money in New York. Leave it to me, and wait a while." But the other was not to be put off. He sat down on the embroidered silk bedspread and demanded abruptly, "What do you expect my income to be a year?" "I'm sure I don't know," laughed Oliver. "Nobody takes the time to add up his income. You'll make what you need, and something over for good measure. The one thing you'll know for certain, the more you spend, the more you'll be able to make." And then, seeing that the sober look was not to be expelled from his brother's face, Oliver seated himself and crossed his legs and proceeded to set forth the paradoxical philosophy of extravagance. His brother had come into a city of millionaires. There was a certain group of people, the right set was Oliver's term for them, and among them he would find that money was as free as air. So far as his career was concerned, he would find that there was nothing in all New York so costly as economy. If he did not live like a gentleman, he would find himself excluded from the circle of the elect. And how he would manage to exist then was a problem too difficult for his brother to face. And so, as quickly as he could, he was to bring himself to a state of mind where things did not surprise him, where he did what others did and paid what others paid, and did it serenely, as if he had done it all his life. He would soon find his place. Meantime, all he had to do was put himself into his brother's charge. "You'll find in time that I have the strings in my hands," the latter added. "Just take life easy, and let me introduce you to the right people." All of which sounded very attractive. "But are you sure," asked Montague, "that you understand what I'm here for? I don't want to get into the 400, you know. I want to practice law." "In the first place," replied Oliver, "don't talk about the 400. It's vulgar and silly. There's no such thing. In the next place, you're going to live in New York, and you want to know the right people. If you know them, you can practice law, or practice billiards, or practice anything else that you fancy. If you don't know them, you might as well go practice in Dahomey, for all you can accomplish. You might come on here and start in for yourself, and in 20 years you wouldn't get as far as you can get in 2 weeks if you let me attend to it." Montague was nearly 5 years his brother's senior, and at home he had taken a semi-parental attitude toward him. Now, however, the situation seemed to have reversed itself. With a slight smile of amusement, he subsided and proceeded to put himself into the attitude of a docile student of the mysteries of the Metropolis. They agreed they would say nothing about these matters to the others. Mrs. Montague was half blind, and would lead her placid indoor existence with old Mammy Lucy. As for Alice, she was a woman, and would not trouble herself with economics. If fairy godmothers chose to shower gifts upon her, she would take them. Alice was built to live in a palace anyway, Oliver said. He had cried out with delight when he first saw her. She had been 16 when he left, and tall and thin. Now she was 19, and with the pale tints of dawn in her hair and face. In the auto, Oliver had turned and stared at her and pronounced the cryptic judgment, "You'll go." Just now she was wandering about the rooms, exclaiming with wonder. Everything here was so quiet and so harmonious that at first one's suspicions were lulled. It was simplicity, but of a strange and perplexing kind, simplicity elaborately studied. It was luxury, but grown assured of itself, and gazing down upon itself with aristocratic disdain. And after a while this began to penetrate the vulgarist mind, and to fill it with awe. One could not remain long in an apartment which is trimmed and furnished in rarest Circassian walnut, and papered with hand-embroidered silk cloth, without feeling some excitement, even though there had been no one to mention that the furniture had cost $8,000 per room, and that the wall coverings had been imported from Paris at a cost of $70 per yard. Montague also betook himself to gazing about. He noted the great double windows with sashes of bronze, the bronze fireproof doors, the bronze electric candles and chandeliers, from which the room was flooded with a soft radiance at the touch of a button, the Duchess and Marquis chairs, with upholstery matching the walls, the huge leather slumber couch, with adjustable lamp at its head. When one opened the door of the dressing-room closet, it was automatically filled with light. There was an adjustable 3-sided mirror at which one could study his own figure from every side. There was a little bronze box near the bed, in which one might set his shoes, and with a locked door opening out into the hall, so that the floor porter could get them without disturbing one. Each of the bathrooms was the size of an ordinary man's parlor, with floor and walls of snow-white marble, and a door composed of an imported plate-glass mirror. There was a great porcelain tub, with glass handles upon the wall by which you could help yourself out of it, and a shower bath with linen duck curtains, which were changed every day, and a marble slab upon which you might lie to be rubbed by the masseur, who would come at the touch of a button. There was no end to the miracles of this establishment, as Montague found in the course of time. There was no chance that the antique bronze clock on the mantel might go wrong, for it was electrically controlled from the office. You did not open the window and let in dust, for the room was automatically ventilated, and you turned a switch marked hot and cold. The office would furnish you a guide who would show you the establishment, and you might see your bread being kneaded by electricity upon an opal glass table, and your eggs being tested by electric light, and you might peer into huge refrigerators ventilated by electric fans, and in which every tiny lamb chop reposed in a separate holder. Upon your own floor was a pantry, provided with hot and cold storage rooms and an airtight dumbwaiter. You might have your own private linen and crockery and plate, and your own family butler, if you wished. Your children, however, would not be permitted in the building, even though you were dying. This was a small concession which you made to a host who had invested $1.5 million in furniture alone. A few minutes later the telephone bell rang, and Oliver answered it and said, "Send him up." "Here's the tailor," he remarked as he hung up the receiver. "Whose tailor?" asked his brother. "Yours," he said. "Do I have to have some new clothes?" Montague asked. "You haven't any clothes at present," was the reply. Montague was standing in front of the costumer, as the elaborate mirror was termed. He looked himself over, and then he looked at his brother. Oliver's clothing was a little like the Circassian walnut. At first you thought it was simple, and even a trifle careless. It was only by degrees you realized that it was original and distinguished, and very expensive. "Won't your New York friends make allowance for the fact that I am fresh from the country?" asked Montague, quizzically. "They might," was the reply. "I know 100 who would lend me money if I asked them, but I don't ask them." "Then how soon shall I be able to appear?" asked Montague, with visions of himself locked up in the room for a week or two. "You are to have 3 suits tomorrow morning," said Oliver. "Genet has promised." "Suits made to order?" gasped the other in perplexity. "He never heard of any other sort of suits," said Oliver, with grave rebuke in his voice. Monsieur Genet had the presence of a Russian Grand Duke, and the manner of a court chamberlain. He brought a subordinate to take Montague's measure, while he himself studied his color scheme. Montague gathered from the conversation that he was going to a house party in the country the next morning, and that he would need a dress suit, a hunting suit, and a morning coat. The rest might wait until his return. The two discussed him and his various points as they might have discussed a horse. He possessed distinction, he learned, and a great deal could be done with him. With a little skill he might be made into a personality. His French was not in training, but he managed to make out that it was Monsieur Genet's opinion that the husbands of New York would tremble when he made his appearance among them. When the tailor had left, Alice came in, with her face shining from a cold bathing. "Here you are decking yourselves out," she cried, "and what about me?" "Your problem is harder," said Oliver, with a laugh. "But you begin this afternoon. Reggie Mann is going to take you with him, and get you some dresses." "What?" gasped Alice. "Get me some dresses? A man?" "Of course," said the other. "Reggie Mann advises half the women in New York about their clothes." "Who is he, a tailor?" asked the girl. Oliver was sitting on the edge of the canopy, swinging one leg over the other, and he stopped abruptly and stared, and then sank back, laughing softly to himself. "Oh, dear me," he said, "poor Reggie." Then realizing that he would have to begin at the beginning, he proceeded to explain that Reggie Mann was a cotillion leader, the idol of the feminine side of society. He was the special pet and protégé of the great Mrs. de Graffenried, of whom they had surely heard. Mrs. de Graffenried, who was acknowledged to be the mistress of society at Newport, and was destined some day to be mistress in New York. Reggie and Oliver were thick, and he had stayed in town on purpose to attend to her attiring. having seen her picture, and vowed that he would make a work of art out of her. And then Mrs. Robbie Walling would give her a dance, and all the world would come to fall at her feet. "You and I are going out to Black Forest, the Wallings' shooting lodge, tomorrow," Oliver added to his brother. "You'll meet Mrs. Robbie there. You've heard of the Wallings, I hope?" "Yes," said Montague. "I'm not that ignorant." "All right," said the other. "We're to motor down. I'm going to take you in my racing car, so you'll have an experience. We'll start early." "I'll be ready," said Montague. And when his brother replied that he would be at the door at 11, he made another amused note as to the habits of New Yorkers. The price which he had paid at the hotel included the services of a valet or a maid for each of them, and so when their baggage arrived they had nothing to do. They went to lunch in one of the main dining rooms of the hotel, a room with towering columns of dark green marble and a maze of palms and flowers. Oliver did the ordering. His brother noticed that the simple meal cost them about $15, and he wondered if they were to eat at that rate all the time. Then Montague mentioned the fact that before leaving home he had received a telegram from General Prentice, asking him to go with him that evening to the meeting of the Loyal Legion. Montague wondered, half amused, if his brother would deem his old clothing fit for such a function. But Oliver replied that it would not matter what he wore there. He would not meet anyone who counted, except Prentice himself. The General and his family were prominent in society, it appeared, and were to be cultivated. But Oliver shrewdly forbore to elaborate upon this, knowing that his brother would be certain to talk about old times, which would be the surest possible method of lodging himself in the good graces of General Prentice. After luncheon came Reggie Mann, dapper and exquisite, with slender little figure and mincing gait, and the delicate hands and soft voice of a woman. He was dressed for the afternoon parade, and wore a wonderful scarlet orchid in his buttonhole. Montague's hand he shook at his shoulder height, but when Alice came in, he did not shake hands with her. Instead, he stood and gazed again, and lifting his hands a little with excessive emotion, exclaimed, "Oh, perfect, perfect!" "And Ollie, I told you so," he added eagerly. "She is tall enough to wear satin. She shall have the pale blue Empire gown. She shall have that pale blue Empire gown if I have to pay for it myself. And oh, what times we shall have with that hair, and the figure! Yuval will simply go wild." So Reggie prattled on with his airy grace. He took her hand and studied it, and then turned her about to survey her figure, while Alice blushed and strove to laugh to hide her embarrassment. "My dear Miss Montague," he exclaimed, "I bring all Gotham and lay it at your feet. Ollie, your battle is won without firing a shot. I know the very man for her. His father is dying, and he will have $4 millions in transcontinental alone. And he is as handsome as Antonius, and as fascinating as Don Juan. Allons, we may as well begin with the trousseau this afternoon." End of chapter 2.
Chapter 3 of the Metropolis by Upton Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Oliver was not rooming with them. He had his own quarters at the club, which he did not wish to leave. But the next morning, about 20 minutes after the hour he had named, he was at the door, and Montague went down. Oliver's car was an imported French racer. It had only 2 seats, open in front, with a rumble behind for the mechanic. It was long and low and rakish, a most wicked-looking object. Whenever it stopped on the street, a crowd gathered to stare at it. Oliver was clad in a black bearskin coat, covering his feet, and with a cap and gloves to match. He wore goggles, pushed up over his forehead. A similar costume lay ready in his brother's seat.
The suits of clothing had come, and were borne in his grips by his valet. "We can't carry them with us," said Oliver. "He'll have to take them down by train." And while his brother was buttoning up the coat, he gave the address. Then Montague clambered in, and after a quick glance over his shoulder, Oliver pressed a lever and threw over the steering wheel, and they whirled about and sped down the street. Sometimes at home in Mississippi one would meet automobiling parties, generally to the damage of one's harness and temper. But until the day before, when he had stepped off the ferry, Montague had never ridden in a motor car. Riding in this one was like traveling in a dream. It slid along without a sound, or the slightest trace of vibration. It shot forward, it darted to the right or to left. It slowed up, it stopped, as if of its own will. The driver seemed to do nothing. Such things as car tracks had no effect upon it at all, and serious defects in the pavement caused only the faintest swelling motion. It was only when it leaped ahead like a living thing that one felt the power of it, by the pressure upon his back. They went at what seemed to Montague a breakneck pace, through the city streets, dodging among trucks and carriages, grazing cars, whirling round corners, taking the wildest of chances. Oliver seemed always to know what the other fellow would do, but the thought that he might do something different kept his companion's heart pounding in a painful way. Once the latter cried out as a man leaped for his life. Oliver laughed and said, without turning his head, "You'll get used to it by and by." They went down Fourth Avenue and turned into the Bowery. Elevated trains pounded overhead, and a maze of gin shops, dime museums, cheap lodging houses, and clothing stores sped past them. Once or twice Oliver's hawk-like glance detected a blue uniform ahead, and then they slowed down to a decorous pace, and the other got a chance to observe the miserable population of the neighborhood. It was a cold November day, and an out-of-work time, and wretched outcast men walked with their shoulders drawn forward and hands in their pockets. "Where in the world are we going?" Montague asked. "To Long Island," said the other. "It's a beastly ride, this part of it, but it's the only way. Some day we'll have an overhead speedway of our own, and we won't have to drive through this mess." They turned off at the approach to the Williamsburg Bridge, and found the street closed for repairs. They had to make a detour of a block, and they turned with vicious sweep and plunged into the very heart of the tenement district. Narrow, filthy streets, with huge, canyon-like blocks of buildings, covered with rusty iron fire escapes, and decorated with soap boxes and pails and laundry and babies. Narrow stoops crowded with playing children, grocery shops, clothing shops, saloons, and a maze of placards and signs in English and German and Yiddish. Through the throng Oliver drove, his brows knitted with impatience and his horn honking angrily. "Take it easy," protested Montague, but the other answered, "Bah!" Children screamed and darted out of the way, and men and women started back, scowling and muttering. When a blockade of wagons and push carts forced them to stop, the children gathered about and jeered, and a group of hoodlums loafing by a saloon flung ribaldry at them. But Oliver never turned his eyes from the road ahead. And at last they were out on the bridge. "Slow vehicles keep to the right," ran the sign, and so there was a lane for them to the left. They sped up the slope, the cold air beating upon them like a hurricane. Far below lay the river, with tugs and ferry boats plowing the wind-beaten gray water, and a city spread out on either bank, a wilderness of roofs, with chimneys sticking up and white jets of steam spouting everywhere. Then they sped down the farther slope and into Brooklyn. There was an asphalted avenue lined with little residences. There was block upon block of them, mile after mile of them. Montague had never seen so many houses in his life before, and nearly all poured out of the same mold. Many other automobiles were speeding out by this avenue, and they raced with one another. The one which was passed the most frequently got the dust and smell, and so the universal rule was that when you were behind you watched for a clear track. You then put on speed and went to the front. But then, just when you had struck a comfortable pace, there was a whirring and a puffing at your left, and your rival came stealing past you. If you were ugly, you put on speed yourself, and forced him to fall back or to run the risk of trouble with vehicles coming the other way. For Oliver, there seemed to be but one rule: pass everything. They came to the great ocean driveway. Here were many automobiles, nearly all going one way, and nearly all racing. There were two which stuck to Oliver, and would not be left behind. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, they passed and repassed. Their dust was blinding, and the continual odor was sickening, and so Oliver set his lips tight, and the little dial on the indicator began to creep ahead, and they whirled away down the drive. "Catch us this time," he muttered. A few seconds later Oliver gave a sudden exclamation, as a policeman, concealed behind a bush at the roadside, sprang out and hailed them. The policeman had a motorcycle, and Oliver shouted to the mechanic, "Pull the cord." His brother turned, alarmed and perplexed, and saw the man reach down to the floor of the car. He saw the policeman leap upon the cycle and start to follow. Then he lost sight of him in the clouds of dust. For perhaps 5 minutes they tore on, tense and silent, at a pace that Montague had never equaled in an express train. Vehicles coming the other way would leap into sight, charging straight at them, it seemed, and shooting past at a hand's breadth away. Montague had just about made up his mind that one such ride would last him for a lifetime, when he noticed that they were slackening up. "You can let go of the cord," said Oliver. "He'll never catch us now." "What is the cord?" asked the other. "It's tied to the tag with our number on in back. It swings it up so it can't be seen." They were turning off into a country road, and Montague sank back and laughed till the tears ran down his cheeks. "Is that a common trick?" he asked. "Quite," said the other. "Mrs. Robbie has a trough of mud in their garage, and her driver sprinkles the tag every time before she goes out. You have to do something, you know, or you'd be taken up all the time." "Have you ever been arrested?" "I've only been in court once," said Oliver. "I've been stopped a dozen times." "What did they do the other times? Warn you?" "Warn me?" laughed Oliver. "What they did was get in with me and ride a block or two out of sight of the crowd, and then I slipped them a $10 bill and they got out." To which Montague responded, "Oh, I see." They turned into a broad macadamized road, and here were more autos and more dust and more racing. Now and then they crossed a trolley or a railroad track, and here was always a warning sign. But Oliver must have had some occult way of knowing that the track was clear, for he never seemed to slow up. Now and then they came to villages, and did reduce speed, but from the pace at which they went through, the villagers could not have suspected it. And then came another adventure. The road was in repair, and was very bad, and they were picking their way, when suddenly a young man, who had been walking on a side path, stepped out before them, and drew a red handkerchief from his pocket, and faced them, waving it. Oliver muttered an oath. "What's the matter?" cried his brother. "We're arrested!" he exclaimed. "What?" gasped the other. "Why, we were not going at all." "I know," said Oliver, "but they got us all the same." He must have made up his mind at one glance that the case was hopeless, for he made no attempt to put on speed, but let the young man step aboard as they reached him. "What is it?" Oliver demanded. "I have been sent out by the Automobile Association," said the stranger, "to warn you that they have a trap set in the next town. So watch out." Oliver gave a gasp and said, "Oh, thank you." The young man stepped off, and they went ahead, and he lay back in his seat and shook with laughter. "Is that common?" his brother asked between laughs. "It happened to me once before," said Oliver, "but I'd forgotten it completely." They proceeded very slowly, and when they came to the outskirts of the village, they went at a funeral pace, while the car throbbed in protest. In front of a country store they saw a group of loungers watching them, and Oliver said, "That's the first part of the trap. They have a telephone, and somewhere beyond is a man with another telephone, and beyond that a man to stretch a rope across the road." "What would they do with you?" asked the other. "Haul you up before a justice of the peace and fine you anywhere from $50 to $250. It's regular highway robbery. There are some places that boast of never levying taxes. They get all their money out of us." Oliver pulled out his watch. "We're going to be late to lunch, thanks to these delays," he said. He added that they were to meet at the Hawk's Nest, which he said was an automobile joint. Outside of town they hit it up again, and half an hour later they came to a huge sign, "To the Hawk's Nest," and turned off. They ran up a hill, came suddenly out of a pine forest into view of a hostelry perched upon the edge of a bluff overlooking the Sound. There was a broad yard in front in which automobiles wheeled and sputtered, and a long shed that was lined with them. Half a dozen attendants ran to meet them as they drew up at the steps. They all knew Oliver, and two fell to brushing his coat, and one got his cap, while the mechanic took the car to the shed. Oliver had a tip for each of them. One of the things Montague observed was that in New York you had to carry a pocketful of change, and scatter it about wherever you went. They tipped the man who carried their coats and the boy who opened the door. In the washrooms they tipped the boys who filled the basins for them and those who gave them a second brushing. The piazzas of the inn were crowded with automobiling parties in all sorts of strange costumes. It seemed to Montague that most of them were flashy people. The men had red faces, and the women had loud voices. He saw one in a sky blue coat with bright scarlet facing. It occurred to him that if these women had not worn such large hats, they would not have needed quite such a supply of the bright colored veiling which they wound over their hats and tied under their chins, or left to float about in the breeze. The dining room seemed to have been built in sections, rambling about on the summit of the cliff. The side of it facing the water was all glass and could be taken down. The ceiling was a maze of streamers and Japanese lanterns, and here and there were orange trees and palms and artificial streams and fountains. Every table was crowded, it seemed. One was half deafened by the clatter of plates, the voices and laughter, and the uproar of a Negro orchestra of banjos, mandolins, and guitars. Negro waiters flew here and there, and a huge, stout-headed waiter, who was pirouetting and strutting, suddenly espied Oliver and made for him with smiles of welcome. "Yes, sir, just come in, sir," he said, and led the way down the room to where, in a corner, a table had been set for 16 or 18 people. There was a shout, "Here's Ollie," and a pounding of glasses and a chorus of "Welcome! Hello, Ollie, you're late. Ollie, what's the matter? Car broke down?" Of the party, about half were men and half women. Montague braced himself for the painful ordeal of being introduced to 16 people in succession, but this was considerately spared him. He shook hands with Robbie Walling, a tall and rather hollow-chested young man with slight yellow mustaches, and with Mrs. Robbie, who bade him welcome and presented him with the freedom of the company. Then he found himself seated between two young ladies, with a waiter leaning over him to take his order for the drinks. He said,
a little hesitantly, that he would like some whiskey, as he was about frozen, upon which the girl on his right remarked, "You'd better try a champagne cocktail. You'll get your results quicker," she added to the waiter. "Bring a couple of them and be quick about it." "You had a cold ride, no doubt, in that low car," she went on to Montague. "What made you late?" "We had some delays," he answered. "Once we thought we were arrested." "Arrested!" she exclaimed, and others took up the word, crying, "Oh, Ollie, tell us about it." Oliver told the tale, and meantime his brother had a chance to look about him. All the party were young. He judged that he was the oldest person there. They were not of the flashily dressed sort, but no one would have had to look twice to know that there was money in the crowd. They had had their first round of drinks, and started in to enjoy themselves. They were all intimates, calling each other by their first names. Montague noticed that these names always ended in IE. There was Robbie, and Freddie, and Augie, and Clary, and Bertie, and Chappie. If their names could not be made to end properly, they had nicknames instead. Ollie told how they had distanced a policeman, and Clary Mason, one of the younger sons of the once mighty railroad king, told of a similar feat which his car had performed. And then the young lady who sat beside him told how a fat Irish woman had skipped out of their way as they rounded a corner, and stood and cursed them from the vantage point of the sidewalk. The waiter came with the liquor, and Montague thanked his neighbor, Miss Price. Annabel Price was her name, and they called her Billy. She was a tall and splendidly formed creature, and he learned in due time that she was a famous athlete. She must have divined that he would feel a little lost in this crowd of intimates, and set to work to make him feel at home, an attempt in which she was not altogether successful. They were bound for a shooting lodge, and so she asked him if he were fond of shooting. He replied that he was. In answer to a further question, he said that he had hunted chiefly deer and wild turkey. "Ah, then, you're a real hunter," said Miss Price. "I'm afraid you'll scorn our way." "What do you do?" he inquired. "Wait, and you'll see," she replied, and added casually, "when you get to be pally with us, you'll conclude we don't furnish." Montague's jaw dropped just a little. He recovered himself, however, and said that he presumed so, or that he trusted not. Afterwards, when he had made inquiries and found out what he should have said, he had completely forgotten what he had said. Down in a hotel in Natchez, there was an old head waiter to whom Montague had once appealed to seat him next to a friend. At the next meal, learning that the request had been granted, he said to the old man, "I'm afraid you have shown me partiality." To which the reply came, "I always tries to show it as much as I can." Montague always thought of this whenever he recalled his first encounter with Billy Price. The young lady on the other side of him now remarked that Robbie was ordering another topsy-turvy lunch. He inquired what sort of lunch that was. She told him that Robbie called it a digestion exercise. That was the only remark that Miss de Mille addressed to him during the meal. Miss Gladys de Mille, the banker's daughter, known as Baby to her intimates. She was a stout and round-faced girl who devoted herself strictly to the business of lunching, and Montague noticed at the end that she was breathing rather hard, and that her big round eyes seemed bigger than ever. Conversation was general about the table, but it was not easy conversation to follow. It consisted mostly of what is known as joshing, and involved acquaintance with intimate details of personalities and past events. Also, there was a great deal of slang used, which kept the strangers' wits on the jump. However, Montague concluded that all his deficiencies were made up for by his brother, whose sallies were the cause of the loudest laughter. Just now he seemed to the other more like the Oliver he had known of old, for Montague had already noted a change in him. At home there had never been any end to his gaiety and fun.
and it was hard to get him to take anything seriously. But now he kept all his jokes for company, and when he was alone he was in deadly earnest. Apparently he was working hard over his pleasures. Montague could understand how this was possible. Someone, for instance, had worked hard over the ordering of the lunch, to secure the maximum of explosive effect. It began with ice cream, molded in fancy shapes, and then buried in white of egg and baked brown. Then there was turtle soup, thick and green and greasy, and then, horrors of horrors, a great steaming plum pudding. It was served in a strange phenomenon of a platter, with 6 long silver legs, and the waiter set it in front of Robbie Walling and lifted the cover with a sweeping gesture, and then removed it and served it himself. Montague had about made up his mind that this was the end, and began to fill up on bread and butter, when there appeared cold asparagus, served in individual silver holders resembling andirons. Then, appetite now being sufficiently whetted, there came quail in piping hot little casseroles, and then half a grapefruit set in a block of ice and filled with wine, and then little squab ducklings bursting fat, and an artichoke, and then a café parfait, and then, as if to crown the audacity, huge thick slices of roast beef. Montague had given up long ago. He could keep no track of the deluge of food which poured forth, and between all the courses there were wines of precious brands, tumbled helter-skelter, sherry and port, champagne and claret and liqueur. Montague watched poor Baby DeMille out of the corner of his eye, and pitied her, for it was evident that she could not resist the impulse to eat whatever was put before her, and she was visibly suffering. He wondered whether he might not manage to divert her by conversation, but he lacked the courage to make the attempt. The meal was over at 4 o'clock. By that time most of the other parties were far on their way to New York, and the inn was deserted. They possessed themselves of their belongings, and one by one their cars whirled away toward Black Forest. Montague had been told that it was a shooting lodge. He had a vision of some kind of rustic shack, and wondered dimly how so many people would be stowed away. When they turned off the main road, his brother remarked, "Here we are," and he was surprised to see a rather large building of granite, with an archway spanning the road. He was still more surprised when they whizzed through and went on. "Where are we going?" he asked. "To Black Forest," said Oliver. "And what was that we passed?" "That was the gatekeeper's lodge," was Oliver's reply. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of the Metropolis by Upton Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. They ran for about 3 miles upon a broad macadamized avenue, laid straight as an arrow's flight through the forest, and then the sound of the sea came to them, and before them was a mighty granite pile, looming grim in the twilight, with a drawbridge and moat, and 4 great castellated towers. Black Forest was built in imitation of a famous old fortress of Provence, only the fortress had 40 small rooms, and its modern prototype had 70 large ones, and now every window was blazing with lights. A man does not let himself be caught twice in such a blunder, and having visited a shooting lodge, which had cost $750,000 and was set in a preserve of 10,000 acres, he was prepared for Adirondack camps, which cost $500,000, and Newport cottages, which had cost $1 million or two. Liveried servants took the car, and others opened the door and took their coats. The first thing they saw was a huge fireplace, a fireplace a dozen feet across, made of great boulders, and with whole sections of a pine tree blazing in it. Underfoot was polished hardwood, with skins of bear and buffalo. The firelight flickered upon shields and battle axes and broadswords hung upon the oaken pillars, while between them were tapestries picturing the Song of Roland and the Battle of Roncesvalles. One followed the pillars of the great hall to the vaulted roof, whose glass was glowing blood red in the western light. A broad stairway ascended to the second floor, which opened upon galleries about the hall. Montague went to the fire, and stood rubbing his hands before the grateful blaze. "Scotch or Irish, sir?" inquired a lackey, hovering at his side. He had scarcely given his order when the door opened, and a second motor car load of the party appeared, shivering and rushing for the fire. In a couple of minutes they were all assembled, and roaring with laughter over Baby de Mille's account of how her car had run over a dachshund. "Oh, do you know," she cried, "he simply popped." Half a dozen attendants hovered about, and soon the tables in the hall were covered with trays containing decanters and siphons. By this means everybody in the party was soon warmed up, and then in groups they scattered to amuse themselves. There was a great hall for indoor tennis, and there were half a dozen squash courts. Montague knew neither of these games, but he was interested in watching the water polo in the swimming tank, and in studying the appointments of this part of the building. The tank, with the walls and floors about it, were all of marble. There was a bronze gallery running about it, from which one might gaze into the green depths of the water. There were luxurious dressing rooms for men and women, with hot and cold needle baths, steam rooms with rubbers in attendance, and weighing and lifting machines, electric machines producing violet rays, and electric air blasts for the drying of the women's hair. He watched several games in which men and women took part, and later on, when the tennis and other players appeared, he joined them in a plunge. Afterward he entered one of the electric elevators and was escorted to his room, where he found his bag unpacked and his evening attire laid out upon the bed. It was about 9 when the party went into the dining room, which opened upon a granite terrace and loggia facing the sea. The room was finished in some rare black wood, the name of which he did not know. Soft radiance suffused it, and the table was lighted by electric candles set in silver sconces, and veiled by silk shades. It gleamed with its load of crystal and silver, set off by scattered groups of orchids and ferns. The repast of the afternoon had been simply a lunch, it seemed, and now they had an elaborate dinner, prepared by Robbie Walling's famous $10,000 chef. In contrast with the uproar of the inn was the cloistered stillness of this dining room, where the impassive footmen seemed to move on padded slippers, and the courses appeared and vanished as if by magic. Montague did his best to accustom himself to the gowns of the women, which were cut lower than any he had ever seen in his life, but he hesitated every time he turned to speak to a young lady beside him, because he could look so deep down into her bosom, and it was difficult for him to realize that she did not mind it. The conversation was the same as before, except that it was a little more general and louder in tone, for the guests had become more intimate, and as Robbie Walling's wines of priceless vintage poured forth, they became a little high. The young lady who sat on Montague's right was a Miss Vincent, a granddaughter of one of the Sugar Kings. She was dark-skinned and slender, and had appeared at a recent lawn fête in the costume of an Indian maiden. The company amused itself by selecting an Indian name for her. All sorts of absurd ones were suggested, depending upon various intimate details of the young lady's personality and habits. Robbie caused a laugh by suggesting Little Dewdrop. It appeared that she had once been discovered writing a poem about a dewdrop. Someone else suggested Little Raindrop, and then Ollie brought down the house by exclaiming, "Little Raindrop in the mud puddle." A perfect gale of laughter swept over the company, and it must have been a minute before they could recover their composure. In order to appreciate the humor of the sally, it was necessary to know that Miss Vincent had come a cropper at the last meet of the Long Island Hunt Club, and had been extricated from a slough several feet deep. This was explained to Montague by the young lady on his left, the one whose half-dressed condition caused his embarrassment. She was only about 20, with a wealth of golden hair, and the bright innocent face of a child. He had not yet learned her name, for everyone called her Cherub. Not long after this she made a remark across the table to Baby DeMille, a strange jumble of syllables, which sounded like English, yet was not. Miss DeMille replied, and several joined in, until there was quite a conversation going on. Cherub explained to him that Baby had invented a secret language, made by transposing letters, and that Ollie and Bertie were crazy to guess the key to it, and could not. The dinner lasted until late. The wine glasses continued to be emptied, and to be magically filled again. The laughter was louder, and now and then there were snatches of singing. Women lolled about in their chairs. One beautiful boy sat gazing dreamily across the table at Montague, now and then closing his eyes and opening them more and more reluctantly. The attendants moved about, impassive and silent as ever. No one seemed to be cognizant of their existence. But Montague could not help noticing them, and wondering what they thought of it all. When at last the party broke up, it was because the bridge players wished to get settled for the evening. The others gathered in front of the fireplace, and smoked and chatted. At home, when one planned a day's hunting, he went to bed early and rose before dawn. But here it seemed there was game aplenty, and the hunters had nothing to consider save their own comfort. The cards were played in the vaulted gun room. Montague strolled through it, and his eyes ran down the wall, lined with glass cases, and filled with every sort of firearm known to the hunter. He recalled, with a twinge of self-abasement, that he had suggested bringing his shotgun along. He joined the group in one corner and lounged in the shadows, and studied Billy Price, whose conversation had so mystified him. Billy, whose father was a banker, proved to be a devotee of horses. She was a veritable Amazon, the one passion of whose life was glory. Seeing her sitting in this group, smoking cigarettes and drinking highballs, and listening impassively to risque stories, one might easily draw base conclusions about Billy Price. But as a matter of fact, she was made of marble, and the men, instead of falling in love with her, made her their confidante, and told her their troubles, and sought her sympathy and advice. Some of this was explained to Montague by a young lady who, as the evening wore on, came in and placed herself beside him. "My name is Betty Wyman," she said, "and you and I will have to be friends, because Ollie's my side partner." Montague had to meet her advances, so he had not much time to speculate as to what the term side partner might be supposed to convey. Betty was a radiant little creature, dressed in a robe of deep crimson, made of some soft and filmy and complicated material. There was a crimson rose in her hair, and a living glow of crimson in her cheeks. She was bright and quick, like a butterfly, full of strange whims and impulses. Mischievous lights gleamed in her eyes, and mischievous smiles played about her adorable little cherry lips. Some strange perfume haunted her filmy dress, and completed the bewilderment of the intended victim. "I have a letter of introduction to Mr. Wyman in New York," said Montague. "Perhaps he is a relative of yours?" "Is he a railroad president?" asked she, and when he answered in the affirmative, "Is he a railroad king?" she whispered in a mocking, awe-stricken voice. "Is he rich? Oh, rich as Solomon? And is he a terrible man who eats people alive all the time?" "Yes," said Montague, "that must be the one." "Well," said Betty, "he has done me the honor to be my granddaddy. But don't you take any letter of introduction to him." "Why not?" he asked, perplexed. "Because he'll eat you," said the girl. "He hates Ollie." "Dear me," said the other, and the girl asked, "Do you mean that the boy hasn't said a word about me?" "No," said Montague. "I suppose he left it for you to do." "Well," said Betty, "it's like a fairy story. Do you ever read fairy stories? In this story there was a princess. Oh, the most beautiful princess! Do you understand?" "Yes," said Montague. "She wore a red rose in her hair." "And then," said the girl, "there was a young courtier, very handsome and gay, and they fell in love with each other. But the terrible old king, he wanted his daughter to wait a while, until he got through conquering his enemies, so that he might have time to pick out some prince or other, or maybe some ogre who was wasting his lands. Do you follow me?" "Perfectly," said he. "And then did the beautiful princess pine away?" "No," said Betty, pursing her lips. "But she had to dance terribly hard to keep from thinking about herself. Then she laughed and exclaimed, 'Dear me, we are getting poetical.' And next, looking sober again, 'Do you know, I was half afraid to talk to you. Ollie tells me you're terribly serious. Are you?" "I don't know," said Montague, but she broke in with a laugh. "We were talking about you at dinner last night. They had some whipped cream done up in funny little curlicues, and Ollie said, 'Now if my brother Allen were here, he'd be thinking about the man who fixed this cream, and how long it took him, and how he might have been reading The Simple Life.' Is that true?" "It involves a question of literary criticism," said Montague. "I don't want to talk about literature," exclaimed the other. In truth, she wanted nothing save to feel of his armor, and find out if there were any weak spots through which he could be teased. Montague was to find in time that the adorable Miss Elizabeth was a very thorny species of rose. She was more like a gay-colored wasp of predatory temperament. "Ollie says you want to go downtown and work," she went on. "I think you're awfully foolish. Isn't it much nicer to spend your time in an imitation castle like this?" "Perhaps," said he, "but I haven't any castle." "You might get one," answered Betty. "Stay around a while, and let us marry you to a nice girl. They will all throw themselves at your feet, you know, for you have such a delicious melting voice, and you look romantic and exciting." Montague made a note to inquire whether it was customary in New York to talk about you so frankly to your face. Miss Betty was surveying him quizzically meantime. "I don't know," she said, "on second thoughts. Maybe you'll frighten the girls. Then it will be the married women who fall in love with you. You have to watch out." "I've already been told that by my tailor," said Montague, with a laugh. "That would be a quicker way of making your fortune," said she. "But I don't think you'd fit in the role of a tame cat." "A what?" he exclaimed, and Miss Betty laughed. "Don't you know what that is? Dear me, how charmingly naive! But perhaps you'd better get Ollie to explain for you." That brought the conversation to the subject of slang, and Montague, in a sudden burst of confidence, asked for an interpretation of Miss Price's cryptic utterance. "She said," he repeated slowly, "that when I got to be pally with her, I'd conclude she didn't furnish." "Oh, yes," said Miss Wyman. "She just meant that when you knew her, you'd be disappointed. You see, she picks up all the racetrack slang. One can't help it, you know, and last year she took her coach over to England, so she's got all the English slang. That makes it hard even for us." and then Betty sailed in to entertain him with little sketches of other members of the party. A phenomenon that struck Montague immediately was the extraordinary freedom with which everybody in New York discussed everybody else. As a matter of fact, one seldom discussed anything else, and it made not the least difference though the person were one of your set, though he ate your bread and salt and you ate his. Still you would amuse yourself by pouring forth the most painful and humiliating and terrifying things about him. There was poor Clary Mason. Clary, sitting in at bridge, with an expression of feverish eagerness upon his pale face. Clary always lost, and it positively broke his heart, though he had 10 millions laid by on ice. Clary went about all day, bemoaning his brother, who had been kidnapped. Had Montague not heard about it? Well, the newspapers called it a marriage, but it was really a kidnapping. Poor Larry Mason was good-natured and weak in the knees. He had been carried off by a terrible creature, 3 times as big as himself, and with a temper like—oh, there were no words for it. She had been an actress, and now she had carried Larry away in her talons, and was building a big castle to keep him in, for he had 10 millions too, alas! And then there was Bertie Stuyvesant, beautiful and winning, the boy who had sat opposite Montague at dinner. Bertie's father had been a coal man, and nobody knew how many millions he had left. Bertie was gay. Last week he invited them to a brook trout breakfast in November, and that had been a lark. Somebody had told him that trout never really tasted good unless you caught them yourself, and Bertie had suddenly resolved to catch them for that breakfast. "They have a big preserve up in the Adirondacks," said Betty, and Bertie ordered his private train, and he and Chappie de Peyster and some others started that night. They drove I don't know how many miles the next day, and caught a pile of trout, and we had them for breakfast the next morning. The best joke of all is that Chappie vows that they were so full they couldn't fish, and that the trout were caught with nets. Poor Bertie! Somebody'll have to separate him from that decanter now." From the hall there came loud laughter, with sounds of scuffling and cries. "Let me have it." "That's Baby de Mille," said Miss Wyman. "She's always wanting to roughhouse it. Robbie was mad the last time she was down here. She got to throwing sofa cushions and upset a vase. Isn't that supposed to be good form?" asked Montague. "Not at Robbie's," said she. "Have you had a chance to talk with Robbie yet? You'll like him. He's serious, like you." "What's he serious about?" "About spending his money," said Betty. "That's the only thing he has to be serious about." "Has he got so very much?" "30 or 40 millions," she replied. "But then, you see, a lot of it's in the inner companies of his railroad system, and it pays him fabulously. And his wife has money too. She was a Miss Mason, you know. Her father's one of the steel crowd. We have a saying that there are millionaires, and then multimillionaires, and then Pittsburgh millionaires. Anyhow, the 2 of them spend all their income in entertaining. It's Robbie's fad to play the perfect host. He likes to have lots of people round him. He does put up good times, only he's so very important about it, and he has so many ideas of what is proper. I guess most of his set would rather go to Miss Jack Warden's any day. I'd be there tonight if it hadn't been for Ollie." "Who's Mrs. Jack Warden?" asked Montague. "Haven't you ever heard of her?" said Betty. "She used to be Mrs. Van Ambridge, and then she got a divorce and married Warden, the big lumber man. She used to give boy and girl parties, in the English fashion, and when we went there we'd do as we please, play tag all over the house, and have pillow fights, and ransack the closets, and get up masquerades. Mrs. Warden's as good-natured as an old cow. You'll meet her sometimes. Only don't you let her fool you with those soft eyes of hers. You'll find she doesn't mean it. It's just that she likes to have handsome men hanging round her." At 1 o'clock a few of Robbie's guests went to bed, Montague among them. He left 2 tables of bridge fiends sitting immobile, the women with flushed faces and feverish hands, and the men with cigarettes dangling from their lips. There were trays and decanters beside each card table, and in the hall he passed 3 youths staggering about in each other's arms, and feebly singing snatches of coon songs. Ollie and Betty had strolled away together to parts unknown. Montague had entered his name in the order book to be called at 9 o'clock. The man who awakened him brought him coffee and cream upon a silver tray, and asked him if he would have anything stronger. He was privileged to have his breakfast in his room, if he wished, but he went downstairs, trying his best to feel natural in his elaborate hunting costume. No one else had appeared yet, but he found the traces of last night cleared away, and breakfast ready, served in the English fashion, with urns of tea and coffee upon the buffet. The grave butler and his satellites were in attendance, ready to take his order for anything else under the sun that he fancied. Montague preferred to go for a stroll upon the terrace, and to watch the sunlight sparkling upon the sea. The morning was beautiful. Everything about the place was so beautiful that he wondered how men and women could live here and not feel the spell of it. Billy Price came down shortly afterward, clad in a khaki hunting suit, with knee kilts and button pockets and gun pads and Cossack cartridge loops. She joined him in a stroll down the beach, and talked to him about the coming winter season, with its leading personalities and events, the horse show, which opened next week, and the prospects for the opera, and Mrs. de Graffenried's opening entertainment. When they came back it was 11 o'clock, and they found most of the guests assembled, nearly all of them looking a little pale and uncomfortable in the merciless morning light. As the 2 came in, they observed Bertie Stuyvesant standing by the buffet, in the act of gulping down a tumbler of brandy. "Bertie has taken up the no-breakfast fad," said Billy, with an ironical smile. Then began the hunt. The equipment of Black Forest included a granite building, steam-heated and elaborately fitted, in which an English expert and his assistants raised imported pheasants, magnificent bronze-colored birds with long, floating black tails. Just before the opening of the season, they were dumped by the thousands into the covers, fat and almost tame enough to be fed by hand. And now came the hunters. First they drew lots, for they were to hunt in pairs, a man and a woman. Montague drew Miss Vincent, little raindrop in the mud puddle. Then Ollie, who was master of ceremonies, placed them in a long line, and gave them directions, and at a signal they moved through the forest. Following each person were 2 attendants, to carry the extra guns and reload them, and out in front were men to beat the bushes and scare the birds into flight. Now Montague's idea of hunting had been to steal through the bayou forests, and match his eyes against those of the wild turkey, and shoot off their heads with a rifle bullet. So when one of these birds rose in front of him, he fired, and the bird dropped, and he could have done it forever, he judged, only it was stupid slaughter, and it sickened him. However, if the creatures were not shot, they must inevitably perish in the winter snows, and he had heard that Robbie sent the game to the hospitals. Also, the score was being kept, and Miss Vincent, who was something of a shot herself, was watching him with eager excitement, being wild with desire to beat out Billy Price and Chappie de Peyster, who were the champion shots of the company. Baby DeMille, who was on his left, and who could not shoot at all, was blundering along, puffing for breath and eyeing him enviously, and the attendants at his back were trembling with delight and murmuring their applause. So he shot on, as long as the drive lasted, and again on their way back over a new stretch of the country. Sometimes the birds would rise in pairs, and he would drop them both, and twice, when a blundering flock took flight in his direction, he seized a second gun and brought down a second pair. When the day's sport came to an end, his score was 15 better than his nearest competitor, and he and his partner had won the day. They crowded round to congratulate him, first his partner, and then his rivals, and his host and hostess. Montague found that he had suddenly become a person of consequence. Some who had previously taken no notice of him now became aware of his existence. Proud society belles condescended to make conversation with him, and Clary Mason, who hated De Peyster, made note of a way to annoy him. As for Oliver, he was radiant with delight. "When it came to horses and guns, I knew you'd make good," he whispered. Leaving the game to be gathered up in carts, they made their way home, and there the two victors received their prizes. The man's consisted of a shaving set in a case of solid gold, set with diamonds. Montague was simply stunned, for the thing could not have cost less than $1,000 or $2,000. He could not persuade himself that he had a right to accept of such hospitality, which he could never hope to return. He was to realize in time that Robbie lived for the pleasure of thus humiliating his fellow men. After luncheon the party came to an end. Some set out to return as they had come, and others, who had dinner engagements, went back with their host in his private car, leaving their autos to be returned by the chauffeurs. Montague and his brother were among these, and about dusk, when the swarms of working people were pouring out of the city, they crossed the ferry and took a cab to their hotel. End of chapter 4.